Okay, thank you, David. So as David mentioned, this is a co-authored paper with Jonathan Mazur. I'll do the presentation, but we'll both answer questions. And this paper has, I guess, two purposes. One is to document in a semi-rigorous way how agencies deal with uncertain costs and benefits, and the other is to propose what we think is a pretty commonsensical way for them to approach these problems in the future. So Jonathan and I have written a lot of papers about cost-benefit analysis and the way that regulators actually use cost-benefit analysis, like the EPA and the other regulators. And they don't do a very good job. This table just shows a survey we did from 2010 to 2013. And as you can see, in the cost-benefit analyses that agencies produce, they typically do not fully quantify the benefits and costs. And by this, we don't mean that, they're theoretical costs and benefits that they overlook, or that they're really small costs and benefits that they justifiably ignore. We mean that the agencies will typically say, here are a bunch of benefits that this regulation will produce. We can quantify one or two of them, but we can't quantify the other ones. Nonetheless, we think the other ones are quite significant, and therefore we're going to go through with the regulation. Now, typically it's the case that the regulation nonetheless passes a cost-benefit analysis, at least according to the agency. But there's a problem with the failure to quantify. One is that in at least some cases, it seems likely that a regulation would fail a cost-benefit analysis, but for, the hypothetical, very large, unquantified benefit. But another problem, which I think is more serious and is typically overlooked, is that if an agency issues a regulation that says that it's cost justified and doesn't fully quantify all the benefits, then it may turn out that the regulation is actually far too weak. And if you took into account if you actually quantified the other benefits, it would become clear that the agency is under-regulating. On the cost side, usually you can find market valuations for the costs, whereas on the benefit side, it's often hard to do that. Now, when agencies explain why they fail to quantify benefits, and I should say, by the way, there's a bit of an ambiguity in the term quantify. Quantifying benefits could mean something like, counting them up, like how much mercury goes into the air. But our real focus is monetizing benefits. So it means how much mercury goes into the air, what effect that has on people's health, and what monetary valuation we should attach to that effect. So when agencies don't quantify, they usually give one of two explanations. One is they just have no idea what either the causal effect of the regulation will be. So, for example, one regulation that reduced the mercury emissions of power plants, the agency said there's evidence that people who ingest mercury are more likely to have heart attacks, but they didn't actually know how much more likely it is that people would have heart attacks. So they didn't quantify that benefit. And another example, which I think is very interesting, is regulations that improved the nutritional quality of school lunches for children. The agency said, well, we actually have no idea whether children will be better off if they eat apples rather than potato chips. I mean, it seems plausible, but we don't know actually what the effect would be. And then the other explanation is that some benefits are not quantifiable in principle. And so examples from the regulations that we look at is one regulation expanded the definition of a disability, which created benefits for disabled people of various types in the employment setting. And the agency argued that this would confer dignity on disabled people, but they didn't explain, how much or what that meant or how valuable that was. And in another regulation concerning veterans, the agency said that the regulation would make veterans better off, and this would have equity benefits. This would have distributional benefits. Interestingly, I did a search. I was wondering, are veterans actually poor? And when I did the search in Google, the first thing that came up was the Department of Labor website, which had employment and median income information for veterans, which actually was higher than that for the average American. So just saying that benefiting veterans is going to improve distributional outcomes is plainly insufficient, although it's certainly possible. If it the regulation helps very poor veterans, it could have that effect. So what should agencies do when they face these sorts of problems? And I'm going to focus on the uncertainty problem because that's the topic of this conference, although I do think I'm going to say a few words about the benefits that have less to do with uncertainty and more to do with sort of philosophical concerns about whether you can really monetize things like dignity. And a very simple argument here is that we should think of cost-benefit analysis in Bayesian terms, or in terms of subjective probability. Regulators, rather than just throwing up their hands when there's not much empirical evidence about the likely effect of a regulation on human well-being, should actually just guess. Okay, at the extreme, they should just guess. Often they can make an informed guess, or an estimate or a guesstimate, if you want to call it that. But the important thing is that they should say this. I think this is almost certainly what they already do. They already do just guess. But that's not what they write down. They write down a kind of a phony cost-benefit analysis. So if they write down their guess, or in other words, they say, we think that the mercury ingestion will increase the probability of a heart attack by 1 in 500,000 or 1 in a million, whatever, sometimes there will be information they can use to put constraints on what a plausible guess would be. That would be a step forward. And then once they put in their guesses or estimates or priors or whatever you want to call, they should do the full cost-benefit analysis with that information in it. Now you might say the result would be just as arbitrary as simply saying, well, the benefits are unquantified and we're going to go ahead because we think they're high. But I don't think that's correct. I think, first of all, this type of exercise is a useful type of intellectual discipline. But I think more important is the writing down of it, the publicizing of it, so that other people can come in and criticize some of the assumptions or guesses that go into a cost-benefit analysis. The agency should be required when they make guesses to be consistent. So this happens from time to time. The current social cost of carbon, which I think is basically just a guess, is nonetheless a guess that all agencies have to use. It was a guess produced by an interagency group. And that interagency consistency has virtues because it reduces the ability of agencies to make up numbers for strategic reasons. Another institutional response to the problem of uncertainty is to require agencies to revisit their guesses as information comes out and to do studies. With the benefit of hindsight, they can update their guesses in the light of new information. One of the excuses that agencies often give for just guessing or, for not quantifying benefits is that they don't have the resources. Sometimes that's the case. If that's the case, nonetheless, for example, if there's a deadline, nonetheless, in the future, they can use resources that they have to revisit and update their previous estimates. With respect to dignity and equity, I don't think equity claims can really be monetized in a useful way, but they can be quantified in a way that agencies simply don't do. We didn't find a single regulation where agencies invoke equity in other than a boilerplate way. But in fact, you can estimate the impact of a regulation on, different demographic segments and make a claim that in fact a regulation helps poor people if that is a justification for it. And that's a claim that can be empirically investigated, later on if that's necessary. I think in the interest of time, I'll skip our argument about dignity, but I'm happy to come back to it. So let me just go through a quick example and then I'll stop. So the EEOC issued some regulations that expanded the definition of disability under the Americans with Disability Act. I believe they did this because they were required to do this by statute. And I do want to say parenthetically that often agencies have to act and issue a regulation even if the regulation would fail a cost-benefit analysis because a statute requires them to do so. And that's fine. They should go ahead and issue the regulation. But they should also issue the cost-benefit analysis that reveals to the world that in fact the regulation fails a cost-benefit analysis because that has useful virtues for transparency and public deliberation. But in any event, the EEOC goes ahead and does this, and they do a lot of quantification. So as I mentioned before, on the cost side, agencies are usually fairly rigorous. They conduct surveys, for example, in order to obtain additional information, and they gather information that's available already. So for example, in this case, the EEOC determined that under this expanded definition of disability, there'd be an additional 12 to 38 million people who would fall under this definition. And they knew based on data that they already had, or estimates based on data that they already had, that probably of that group, 2 to 6 million people would be entitled to a new accommodation of some sort. Accommodations can be things like, for example, software that if you have vision problems would make it easier for you to input data if that's what your job requires. They also had data that showed that the mean cost of accommodation is $150. That is obviously very crude, but still informative. No doubt some accommodations are very expensive and others are cheap. And based on that, they estimated that this regulation would cost employers $60 to $183 million per year. The initial thing they did is no quantification at all. They just said, sorry, we can't quantify this. After getting some pushback from critics of the regulation, who said, sure, you can quantify it. There's all kinds of data out there. They finally quantified the benefits in the following way. They said there's a survey out there that suggests that every time an employer hires a replacement, it costs about $2,000 because you have to interview people and so forth. And maybe if you multiply this, the agency didn't really do this, but I'm sort of extrapolating from what it said. If you multiply that by 2 to 6 million people, that would equal $4 to $12 billion. And so, clearly the benefits outweigh the costs. And then the agency, as they always do, say there are other benefits, efficiencies in litigation, that's never explained. Fuller employment, that's not explained or justified. Stimulate the economy, nothing about how this regulation would stimulate the economy. And this kind of catch-all that this would reduce stigma, exclusion, humiliation, and promote self-respect, none of which is really, even explained verbally, let alone quantified. Now, this is plainly inadequate. They don't actually show that regulation would reduce the incident of, firing and replacement. They need to think more carefully about what the replacement cost would be if replacement is reduced. There's a big logical flaw here, which is they never explain why employers would not voluntarily provide accommodations if the cost of the accommodations is vastly lower than the cost of replacement. They don't really do an analysis of the effects on the employment market. And that's not because, this would require original work. There are such articles in the literature. There are articles in the literature which look at the effect of the ADA on the employment market and so forth. So, clearly they could get a lot of this information simply by conducting surveys of employers. One thing they could focus on is how much workers value the accommodations that are made available, and then they could aggregate those values. But crucially, they have to take into account the possibility that employers would react in various ways to this regulation. So there is empirical evidence already by Asimoglu and his colleagues that when the ADA was initially enacted, people stopped hiring, employers hired disabled people at a lower rate because they wanted to avoid the costs of accommodation. So that's clearly a possible negative effect of this regulation. You also have to take into account that employers would adjust in other ways. But in any event, all of this can be done, more or less rigorously. I'm out of time. So let me just conclude. And if the regulator has to guess, nonetheless, they should provide over the coming years to do retroactive analysis of the effect of the regulation. So with that, thank you very much.
This is a very rich and interesting paper, but I only have 15 minutes, so I can't really say a lot about many of the issues raised by the paper. Essentially, the proposal is to increase the amount of quantification, in some cases using data that's already available or that would be relatively readily available, in other cases by using a process of Bayesian learning. I wish there was something called Bayesian earning, because that would, as the slide says, but Okay, so I think this is very interesting. I particularly like the idea of the learning part of it because I think that we invest an awful lot in trying to sort of get the first iteration right rather than thinking more in terms of the process of revision and learning. So I really like that, and I like a number of other aspects of the paper. I think the institutional stuff's really interesting, but I don't have time to talk about it today. So what I did end up doing in response to the paper was sort of get excited about the idea of quantification. And I started thinking about the question of whether the costs and benefits of the proposal could be quantified, or what it would take to think about quantifying them, since this is a little bit in the nature of a thought experiment. And that got me to the larger question of whether we can quantify the costs and benefits of regulatory impact analysis, OIRA review, and the rest. One thing I want to say before I start is that I know that there is a huge amount of expertise in this room. Some people with expertise on the inside of this process, other people who have just studied these things for a long time. I would love to hear from people because I'm at least thinking seriously about trying to take a more full gauge attack on this problem and see what that would look like. I found it very difficult to come up with anything. That's not to say it's not out there, and maybe somebody here will send me to a source that lays all this out, but at least it wasn't the first thing that popped up in my Google search. And what I did find seemed old. So, for example, one thing I was interested in was how much do these surveys, these contingent valuation things cost? Really hard to find anything. But I did come up with a 1996 paper, which with cost of living adjustment said $4.5 million a survey. What that looks like compared to current costs, I don't know. There's also a 1997 study by the Congressional Budget Office that says that the cost of an RIA, and I'm pretty sure they mean the drafting cost, not the cost of data collection and modeling, it comes to $720,000, again, adjusted to current dollars. So we don't know that in terms of cost. I think a more significant cost involves delay. OIRA did a big retrospective study of major regulations that it had reviewed, and they came up with a little bit of arithmetic with a $4 billion net benefit per regulation. So if the effect of cost-benefit analysis and the entire process is to delay the regulation 1 year, and we just pick a 5% discount rate, that's a $200 million cost to society in the form of delayed benefits. How much does cost-benefit analysis delay the process? Again, difficult to know. I found a statement that RIAs typically take 3 years, 2.7 years, I think it was. But again, some of that probably overlaps with work that the agency would be doing anyway, so it's a little unclear exactly how that works out. Time for formal consideration by OIRA varies widely. Even from 2010 to 2013, there were big differences. 2013 was a year with long delays of 180 days. That is formal consideration time. That doesn't include whatever delays were caused by informal interactions between the agency and OIRA at other points in the process. And sometimes OIRA has gotten agencies to withdraw proposals so the clock stops running and then they do it again. I mean, it's just complicated. So true delay is not very clear. I figured a half a year was possible, taking into account that the formal delay seems to average something like 90 days, which is the sort of cap in theory of how long it's supposed to take, but then adding in informal delays of one kind or another, half a year. Could be a year, could be 3 months, we don't know. If you combine that with the cost of delay figure I gave earlier, that says there's an average delay cost due to the cost-benefit analysis process of $100 million in essentially lost social benefits. There are also opportunity costs, right? The government has a fixed budget, EPA has a fixed budget, or other agencies, money they spend on one thing can't be spent on something else. very hard to know what the social benefit of $1 of government spending is, if that figure exists anywhere. If you, just to get some benchmark, assume that the result is one fewer regulation per year across the entire government, that's a $4 billion social cost. Is that, again, I'm not making I'm making very weak claims about these particular numbers. The idea is just to sort of start thinking about how we could put numbers on things. What about the M&P proposal to add additional quantification? Again, I have very little idea. I think you'd have to, if we had a good figure for the cost of some of these surveys, for example, we could start by taking the surveys that they're called for in the paper and seeing what those look like. We might be able to do some kind of prorating of some kind based on existing delays and assume that, adding, the delays are proportionate to the amount of analytic additional effort and come up with some figure. We have to think about whether the benefits outweigh the costs and presumably thinking at the margin. So, benefits. So in terms of improved regulatory outcome, there's no benefit when the statute precludes reliance on the CBA. There's a negative benefit if CBA creates bias against regulation. That's hotly disputed. But if you think it does, then that is the social cost. And we have very little empirical evidence and very widely differing priors. I think, we get a prior from Eric and we get a prior from Lisa Heinzerling. They're not going to look very similar. So what do we find about the regulatory cost side? I think it's fair to say, although some people might disagree, that OIRA's primary focus is on reducing regulatory costs rather than increasing benefits. Agencies are assumed to be benefit-oriented, and therefore not to need as much scrutiny on that side. So to what extent is cost-benefit analysis actually reducing regulatory costs? There's an old study by Hahn and another one by Farrow, I think, that tend to show very little impact on costs. There's a recent study that found on average the costs of rules completed in 2012 and 2013 increased between the proposed and final rules, but it was a very skewed distribution with some outliers at the high end. So a little hard to know what to make of that. But at least there doesn't seem to be any clear evidence that the process of RIAs in OIRA review has reduced regulatory costs. There are informational benefits, which Eric mentioned, on the political process, from having improved information about regulations and so forth. So the two questions there is there any way at all of pricing that? Should we do surveys to find out how much people would value that? I don't know. The second point is we really need to compare it with other kinds of research that the government could fund. Maybe increasing NSF economics funding and getting more research on the effectiveness of regulation would in fact be a more cost-effective way of doing it. But we don't know the answer to any of those things. There are incremental benefits from M&P, more studies at the time of the original RIA. The benefit of making priors explicit, which does seem to me would be beneficial. And the net benefit of the Bayesian learning, to the extent to which we actually change regulations or regulatory outcomes or views about regulatory policy down the road. And again, at least at this point, I'm not sure how to quantify any of those, except perhaps on some kind of prorated basis with the overall costs and benefits of CBA. Okay, so I feel like I've been racing along at almost Richard Epstein's speed, but I'm almost at the end. I know, I agree. Okay. So, what have we found? Major data gaps, right? More research would help. I'm really sort of shocked, actually, that there hasn't been more research on this subject. It seems like an obviously important issue. And some of these gaps would be very hard to fill, especially gaps trying to model the effectiveness of the process, empirically taking into account all the other factors, I think that could be a very daunting task. Although economists are very clever, so I don't rule out the idea that you could actually do that. But some of the other stuff should be relatively easy to do. I think I have to say at this point, it's just unclear whether the benefits of CBA, and I do believe that there are benefits. I'm not, although the data doesn't really clearly show that, but I'm willing to believe that. But it's not clear whether they outweigh the costs. It seems to me OIRA really ought to be doing this. That is, they ought to be doing some kind of annual thing that at least says, here were the net benefits of all the proposals we got at the time. Here's how they increased after, between then and the time they were issued. Here's our value added. But I don't see them doing that. What about the M&P proposal? Incremental costs and benefits are very difficult. They provide their own priors and some supporting evidence. And I found this, by the way, I found the evidence really interesting, both on what agencies are doing and on some of the additionally available information. I would also think that it would be useful to try to do some kind of follow-up stuff to try to see whether empirically, for example, in experimental settings, to what extent does quantification of these intangible benefits help people make better decisions or better evaluate policies. At one point in the paper, M&P suggests that all quantifiable benefits should be quantified. I think that is probably not what they mean. It really should be all quantifiable benefits should be quantified when the benefits of doing so outweigh the costs. That may be true in some cases and not in others, and I think the more constructive part of my takeaway would be to try to at least impressionistically think about situations where it would seem highly likely that the cost-benefit would go to one side or the other. For example, in cases where the stuff is already readily available, from other government departments, maybe one where the benefits do outweigh the cost. There may be other situations where it's not true. So, this is the classic ending for all academic presentations, except this time I really mean it. I think this is sort of scandalous that there's not more research on this topic. Thank you.
Coming from the hard sciences, I used to be a physicist. I have a predilection for quantification, and I'm sympathetic to the paper. I think the message is basically right, that one ought to quantify what one can. I think the most important part for me is the idea that one ought to introduce a feedback loop to continually check one's analysis, and also to provide an opportunity for outsiders to participate in that process. I think cost-benefit analysis is really important because it provides a framework for everybody to participate in a set of agreed upon rules. But the advantages for regulation aren't automatic. First of all, I think one has to remember that this is a one-dimensional technique for dealing with, at least at high levels, multi-dimensional problems. And when you're dealing with really serious stuff, a degree of judgment based on experience is just inescapable. There are also, when you're dealing with important decisions, many competing pressures and thumbs on the scale, at least one, often many. And you have to find ways to keep the system honest, which isn't easy. And again, it's very important to provide a really effective opportunity for outsiders to criticize, participate, and basically to challenge agency decisions. To illustrate some of this, I was thinking about how I could contribute. I thought I would just tell some stories about how the Nuclear Regulatory Commission uses cost-benefit analysis in setting rules on nuclear safety. The NRC probably isn't a typical agency, but it does have important responsibilities. I think the important feature is it deals with Well, the most important accidents are the very large accidents, which are also regarded as highly improbable. But nevertheless, the product is the largest of the various possibilities. The product of probability and the consequences are what is the average risk, or the expected risk, and that's what the agency takes as its sort of metric. And reducing that quantity is the benefit of any action that they take. So the cost of the action versus the reduced risk that it would affect. The problem is there's not a lot of data. So you talk here about decision-making under deep uncertainty. I don't know, the NRC is like extreme uncertainty. And unlike some of the recalcitrant agencies that the authors mention, the NRC has wholeheartedly embraced cost-benefit analysis. In fact, they look to it as a kind of anchor in a sea of uncertainty, as a way of rationalizing what they're doing. And in a way, from the point of view of commissioners, who generally don't have a lot of background in the subject, it's a way of kind of automating the process, the decision-making process. In 1985, the agency adopted a rule that this was after the industry complained about the many rules that they were subjected to in the early 80s. This is the period when I was there. And after 3 Mile Island, there were a whole bunch of other problems. Anyhow, they complained about this. And the commission adopted a rule that required cost-benefit analysis for any regulatory requirement for operating reactors. In other words, reactors that had already been licensed. If you're going to increase any requirements, you have to apply a cost-benefit analysis. And they also applied this to their own actions, to any regulations issued by the commission also had to meet this test. It makes sense to have a systematic and thoughtful process in adopting rules, but what the commission did was they used this as an almost insurmountable barrier to any further safety requirements. And this was quite deliberate. It worked in this way in part because the commission counted all the costs, direct, indirect, and so on, but only counted part of the benefits. In other words, they only looked at health effects, reductions in health effects that any safety measure could affect. And since they assumed that in the event of an accident, local governments would evacuate people from the path of any radioactive emissions, there weren't many, people weren't getting dosed heavily, so that number was low. When you multiply that by the small probability of the accident, you got basically something that was insignificant and wasn't worth improving on. So, essentially nothing could pass, and basically nothing did pass. They not only, and I think it's very important that they not only tied the staff process, which the industry was complaining about, but they sort of tied their own hands. They said, look, we really can't do anything because everything we do has to pass this seemingly scientific process. Now, it was only after the Fukushima accident, when it was clear that many of these people who were evacuated safely, in fact, evacuation worked pretty well there, and the doses were indeed low, but, you had 160,000 people evacuated, and many of these, tens of thousands, will never be able to return to their homes. And essentially on a human life, in human terms, large areas are off limits forever. Only then did the NRC begin to take economic costs into account. Now, even so, it doesn't seem to have made much difference because they come up with these very low probability estimates that just smother whatever consequences there are, no matter how large. And I looked at one case recently from last year. It involved what's called a spent fuel pool. This is where the reactor, where the fuel coming out of the reactor is put after it's been used for 5 years. So this contains all the used fuel. And some of these reactors, it contains decades worth of used fuel. So there's much more long-term radioactivity in that spent fuel pool than there is in the reactor itself. And they consider the possibility of a fire. It turns out if you lose water in that pool, the fuel can heat up and burn spontaneously in air and melt, and radioactivity can spread around. And in fact, this was a big concern at Fukushima. It didn't happen, but this was the reason the NRC, I don't know if you remember the headlines, said Americans had to stay away for a radius of 50 miles. And it was a concern about the spent fuel pool at Unit 4 at Fukushima. Now, the staff calculated a very low probability for this accident. But if it were to occur, if you were to have such a fire, they calculated, I thought this was amazing, that you could release 25 times as much radioactivity as was released at Fukushima. And this could contaminate an area the size of New Jersey and force they looked at a particular reactor in Pennsylvania and force the evacuation of 4 million people. But when you multiply the two numbers, you still get a low number. So the commission said it wasn't worth dealing with this. Now, it turns out there's a solution, which is a rather cheap solution, which is basically to move most of the fuel out of the spent fuel pool and into smaller casks off-site. It's relatively cheap. These casks are like $1 million a piece. They take 10 tons of fuel each year. So it's a relatively cheap solution. But the industry is under tremendous pressure right now competing with gas. So they're very, very sensitive to costs. And the commission is, as a consequence, also sensitive to these costs, and they rejected this solution. Now, I want to say what I think is wrong about all this. First of all, the numbers that they base their decisions on are very, very soft. Probabilities depend on they're calculated by very elaborate programs, but they have many, many assumptions about which systems are independent. You know, when two systems are independent, you multiply the probabilities. If they're not independent, if they're coupled, you don't. And you might have two systems that you think are completely independent, have independent power supplies and so on. But if the same guy is coming around putting the wrong oil in both of them, they're not independent anymore. So there's lots and lots of that. There's very little data to work with. The consequence numbers are also very soft because they leave out things. Well, first of all, they leave out things like sabotage and so on because that's hard to calculate. But also, when you think, like, after the Fukushima accident, the Japanese shut down 50 reactors. We don't calculate that sort of thing in considering the cost-benefit analysis in looking at safety equipment. In other words, you just look at what are the consequences, how much stuff is coming out, how many people move, and so on. But if you have an accident on this scale, it has immense political and economic consequences throughout the country. These things don't get fed in. And I think the other thing that's wrong here is that the whole system, all these calculations are based on very, very complicated computer programs. In a way, the system tries to, because there's lacking in data, tries to compensate with kind of the elaborateness of the tools that are used. But they're very, as I say, elaborate. They're also very expensive to use, which means that only the most competent and highly funded outsiders can participate and really, first of all, understand what these people are doing, and second of all, it's basically impenetrable and inaccessible to most groups. And I think courts can't really engage unless there are competent people who bring cases, solid cases to the court. The thing, however, in all this that I find the most troubling is the use of the metric, this probability times consequences. It's one thing to use this when you have a lot of statistics. It makes sense to use probability times consequence, average risk. When you go to a casino and you make a lot of bets, that's basically what you look at. But when you're looking at situations that are highly improbable but could have devastating results, most people take a sort of a risk-averse approach, which is not permissible here. And in this connection, I find it interesting that the nuclear suppliers, like General Electric, say, will not provide equipment to any plant in the world unless they have total immunity from any of the consequences of accident consequences, off-site accident consequences. In other words, they're extremely risk-averse on this. They don't care about the calculations, no matter what the probabilities are. Now, but a mayor or a governor can't do that. Can't say they're saying they don't want to bet the company. He can't say I don't want to bet the state because federal preemption says it's only the 5 great Americans on the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to decide that. Anyhow, to return to the paper, I think quantitative cost-benefit analysis can indeed improve, more use of it can improve regulation, but you have to resist the bureaucratic tendencies to cook the books. And I think the most compelling message in the paper to me is the notion of emphasizing a feedback loop that both helps agencies correct their work. It's hard to get things right the first time, but also allows outsiders to participate and improve the process. Thank you.